welcome to this great panel this evening with very, very interesting and knowledgeable students and chair. Now, I'll very briefly will introduce you to Ronita. Ronita is an associate professor of sustainable built environment and leads the Sustainable Design Research Group at the university and primarily works on reducing health and energy burdens from poverty due to climate warming. So, Ronita, is your session. I'll leave it to you now, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. I think we should remove all the fluff now. Is the clock on?
No, not yet.
We should start it.
Oh, you
Probably,
think?
yes.
It'll take a minute.
That's fine. So if whenever we see this clock, I think it should be there in every city and every corner, just to realize how soon we have to find out challenges to something inevitable. I think there's no doubt climate change is there and we have to tackle it. And I don't think in this session we should discuss or debate even about that. Few facts that scares me, or I think it should also scare politicians, it should scare the next generation, or it should even scare the current generation in itself, that probably year 2022 is the year when we might see the extreme climate event in terms of extreme heat waves or extreme drought or extreme flooding. So it's predicted that we have a 4-year window of 2022 to 2026 that we are going to see major climate events which we have not seen earlier. So it's unprecedented. So I don't think at this point going into the debate of what happens, why should we tackle climate change is even a question. How should we tackle it? Yes, it's a very big question, very difficult and a complex question. Some of the sectors I think we are responding to currently are the major sectors of food, health, also built environment and infrastructure. Because I work in built environment, I am a bit biased, and yes, I want to advocate that a little bit more, primarily because I have seen not through just research, but also through experiencing, that the way we live actually defines us how our future would be. And it may sound rhetorical, it may sound metaphorical, but at this point, the where we are living can actually help us decide where we are leading. So I'll give you a very small example. Today, if we face the devastating heat waves in the global south or in the global north, wherever is the case, are we prepared to kind of mitigate that or adapt to that, or have we even know how much we can adapt to it? Because as a human body, we can only adapt to a certain limit or a certain level. But then are our buildings adapted to cope with that extreme heat? How do we reach that? So today I want to listen from all of you that what do you think as in terms of adaptations, in terms of mechanisms that we can cope with this extreme event which is emergent, it's extremely necessary, and it's probably knocking at our door. Thank you. So, Antoinette, who should be going next?
Whoever you want to start.
And I think just panel, if you can really speak into the microphones. I think some of the online audience was saying it's a little bit hard to hear.
Okay.
But yeah, no worries.
James.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Oh, that sounds like it's working. My name's James Miller. I'm an undergrad student at Pembroke studying natural sciences in my final year now. And I've also been a climate activist ever since I was about 13 or 14. And I've done quite a lot of different things in that time. I started off making short videos about local wildlife in the hopes that it might inspire more people online to step up and help protect it. But then as I grew older and I began to become aware of the threats that nature faced from more global issues like climate change and biodiversity loss, at a global scale, I started working more on political advocacy and campaigning and trying to get the UK government to put these issues, the climate and the biodiversity crisis, higher up the political agenda. And since then, I've done a load of different random things. I've organised a fundraising concert to protect some rainforest. I'm currently doing a podcast. And last year, I went to COP27, which I was involved in mainly from the perspective of activism. I helped set up something in the run-up to COP26 called the Glasgow Climate Clock, which is basically like what you see before you here. It shows two numbers. The top of these, the red one, is our deadline. It's the time scale in which we have left to act. That number is counting down the time we have left until we overrun our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. The bottom number, it's a little more optimistic. That one's counting up the percentage of the world's energy generated by renewable resources. And the idea is if we push that number up as quickly as we can, that will give us more time left to act.
What's the renewable projection based on?
It's based on long-term trajectories of renewable energy installation.
So you're taking the current trends and then extrapolating?
Yes, exactly. But what we did was we created a giant version of this, 7 stories tall, and projected it in the centre of Glasgow City at COP26 in the hope that it might instill some kind of sense of urgency into leaders at the summit. I also attended as a delegate under UNICEF, tried to follow negotiations. It was quite confusing, and tried to smuggle this exact clock in as well into the negotiating space itself. UN security thought it was a bomb. That didn't go very well either. And on the penultimate day of negotiations, I also handed round letters to all of the negotiating teams from children all around the world, letters describing how important their planet was to them and how they wanted world leaders to step up and help protect it. Again, with the hope that this might remind the negotiators in those crucial final days of the responsibility that they had to children all around the world. And this year, I'm running the Cambridge Climate Society, not going to COP27, but enjoying hanging around and enthusing more students right where we are here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. And I think that's a very critical point that you mentioned, that handing over letters of the future generation who would be probably facing the extreme of climate crisis. And that's very important. I was there at COP last year, and unfortunately, my roundtable session was on the last day, just before the negotiations. I was very hopeful because we heard fantastic talks in the roundtable, and I was very hopeful that the political leaders would also be aligning their thoughts towards that. However, we know how disastrous it went. There was a lot of funding cut for a lot of activities that require funding to reduce the climate change figures for certain countries which cannot afford to do it at this point. So I did leave with a very heavy heart, but I want to bring Joycelyn here, who is currently at COP27. And Joycelyn is here. Yeah, Frederica here. Sorry, Frederica here. I want to bring her here. And Frederica, tell us about what you are experiencing there. I know it's just the beginning. Can she hear us?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me okay as well.
Yes.
The connection is a bit patchy for me, but maybe that's the Wi-Fi here. So. Yeah, I'm zooming in from Sharm El-Sheikh. I got the opportunity again this year to go as a delegate with the Cambridge delegation for the full 2 weeks this time. And so a bit about me, I'm a PhD candidate in human geography with Professor Hume since 2020. So I'm already in my 3rd, and I don't say final year, but in my work, I'm looking at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and notions of responsibility. And with that, I do not necessarily mean in terms of climate negotiation. So it's not so much in terms of legal or historic responsibility. I'm more interested in how notions of responsibility connected to the actor level. So people that are involved with the IPCC, for example. And I'm also working part-time as a research assistant in a project on the politics of loss and damage at University College London. So those are kind of my 2 points of focus. So the IPCC and kind of the science policy interface here at COP and how science is involved in the negotiations, and then also loss and damage, which I'm very happy about that there was a lot more public uptake on loss and damage, especially at COP26, where I was last year as well. And so, yes, I'm here now observing the negotiations and also kind of wandering around the blue zone, the pavilion area, and observing and checking out the spaces there. And maybe I can talk about that a bit later on, about some experience I had on the first day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederique. I think, Maya, you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. Is that appropriately close to the microphone? Yes. Yeah, so my name's Maya Rose Craig. I'm a second year doing HSPS at Johns, and I have also been involved in climate change campaigning and activism for a really long time. I think my first environmental campaign that I ran was when I was 11 to do with an oil spill in Bangladesh, and I've been doing stuff basically ever since. And I think sort of my role within the climate movement, I feel like, has shifted a lot over the years, because I think one of the really interesting things is when I first started, that would be like 2013, and at that point climate change still wasn't like a central political issue. It wasn't something that we talked about all the time or thought about all the time. It wasn't something that our politicians talked about all the time. Versus I think that shift, especially within sort of this expansion of the youth climate movement, I think has made a big difference about the way that we do talk and think about climate. So that's been really exciting. So I've sort of gone from feeling like a fairly lone youth voice to feeling like I'm part of a much bigger movement. And I think one of the really interesting things within that is there is now space for nuance within the climate change movement. And so I feel like historically it was always just climate change is happening, please believe me, we really need to do something about it, versus these days one of the things I'm really involved in is sort of advocacy for this concept of global climate justice, which is essentially pushing for equity within the climate change movement, thinking about how climate change links to past to do with colonialism and exploitation, and maybe discussing the role that, say, reparations play in the climate change movement, and talking about indigenous rights within the climate change movement, all of those things that there kind of hasn't been space for historically. So that's I guess where I'm at within the movement these days. I was also lucky enough to go to COP last year, which wasn't a super enjoyable experience, which is one of the reasons I haven't gone back this year. But I was lucky enough to be able to speak inside the conference a couple of times on a panel thing with like Greta Thunberg and Malala and people like that, which was a very, very cool experience. And I was also protesting at the big G7 conference that happened in St Ives the summer before that as well. I think there's sort of this recurring pattern of very big, important international conferences where they promise they're going to talk about climate change and then letting everyone down, essentially. But I think, there's a lot of space to be talking about all of these issues. And I think, just very quickly, one of the few very positive things that I took away from COP as an experience wasn't from being inside, which kind of sucked, but like it was being out in the streets where you did have like youth-led things. You had the youth movement organising, flying people in, especially Indigenous activists from all over the world, and really platforming them and pushing for that global climate justice. And I think that was just one of the really exciting moments where it's sort of a breath of fresh air in contrast to the negotiations, with sort of stepping outside and being like, actually, yeah, there are so many people who are fighting so strongly to sort of, I guess, try and save the world. So, yeah.
No, thank you, Maya, because I think a lot of people have a lot of questions, but I would like to hear from Joycelyn before we move forward.
Hi, I'm Joycelyn. I'm a second-year PhD student working at the intersection of conservation technology and traditional and indigenous knowledge. So my field site is in Ghana, where my family are from, and I'm working on the boundaries of delineated conservation areas and how communities are kind of disconnected from those regions in the name of conservation, and how we do conservation effectively from an environmental perspective, but also equitably from a social perspective. And I also run a climate education, advocacy, communication platform that deals with the intersection of climate science and climate justice. And I too was lucky enough to be at COP26 last year, actually on some panels with Maya. And yeah, mainly at COP last year, working on communicating climate justice, traditional and indigenous justice, going and working with community groups like Stop Cambo, at the marches, the big march, and the family march, which was amazing because you had like mums pushing their kids who had like little signs in their pushchairs, and it was amazing just to see so many people come together. But I agree. I think my favourite part of COP last year was actually nothing to do with COP. I had the opportunity to go to one of Scotland's rainforests and witness coming together of an Indigenous group from Colombia, and also one of the last Gaelic-speaking head of families in Scotland come together and do a tree planting ceremony. And I think that's something I've kept from COP, is just that sometimes it becomes a huge bubble and we forget that there are people who aren't even there, who are at the front lines, who will continue to working to solve the climate crisis outside of the negotiations. And that's not to say that what happens at the negotiations isn't important, but I think we should also pay mind to those who aren't there, and those who are putting their lives literally, physically on the line for this crisis and for defending the planet.
No, thank you, Joycelyn. I think the common theme that I've been hearing from across, it also resonates with me, because I also didn't enjoy the COP last year, as I said, and I was really on the last day, and it was really grim when I was leaving, and it's the same experience across the panel. That kind of shows that probably there are certain themes that are not being picked up. And I want to ask the panel that, according to your experience, what is it in that will actually make the politicians take up some of these agendas? Because these are very clear, there are facts out, people are demonstrating about it, and people like you are actually forcing it to be more visual, more public. Then how is it not being still visible, or it's blindsided by the politicians who are making the final decision, although they aren't the whole thing, but still?
I don't know if this makes sort of climate change as an issue more or less scary, but I think climate change is such an intersectional issue, and it's so interwoven with other things that it's kind of like, in order to solve climate change, we need to also be thinking about lots of other things. So, for example, I think one of the reasons that our government in the UK really sucks when it comes to climate change is because they're sort of veering further and further towards the right, for example. Or, acknowledging the fact that climate change is totally linked up with race and gender and class. And so I think sort of when we start to unwind those things a bit, that's when we start to finally be able to solve climate change. But I think that's one of the reasons that it feels like so many of our governments are failing when it comes to it, because I think solving environmental issues is bizarrely seen as such a progressive thing, which is, anyway, so bizarre. But it means that if we get governments who are more liberal, or who consider themselves more liberal, that's when you start to get governments who care about these issues, because otherwise the only solution really is economy and financial incentive, which is one of the reasons that I personally really advocate for this concept of the green economy, because it's even though we do need very radical change in the long term in order to prevent and cope and deal with climate change, at the moment I can see very few governments who'd be willing to make that change, and so you need to sort of come up with a stepping stone. And I think for me that is what green economy is. It is a money-based way of thinking about climate change, and I think that's the furthest that we can go right now, unfortunately.
Anybody else wants to?
I think on the money aspect, one of the reasons we don't see a huge amount of action is because of the kind of intersection between finance and political interest. And a huge part of that, one of the most disappointing things last year about COP was, how much of the delegation from fossil fuel companies kind of overstated even, Indigenous delegate. All of the Indigenous delegation was outnumbered by fossil fuel interest. And so I think we can't decouple that influence from government action. They aren't really incentivized, or they don't feel incentivized to do the right thing, because they have ties and are very linked up with fossil fuel companies. I mean, I don't know what it stands like now at COP27, but last year I know that a few months before the conference, the UK government had sat down with the gas companies who were present at COP to talk about how they were going to manage those relationships. And so I don't think we can even talk about government action until those relationships are severed, because they will continue to have an influence.
James, do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I think the only real answer is sustained public pressure. I think we've seen, in the past it does work when we had the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion and one of David Attenborough's documentaries, all in coincision in the 2018-2019 period, we saw a huge spike in public interest in the number of times these issues were mentioned in newspapers and media around the world. And we saw that trickle through into political rhetoric and in some cases into policy and legislation as well. And it feels like that's kind of died off a bit recently. And Extinction Rebellion has fallen a little out of favour as well. And I think we need to find a way to keep the pressure up, to make sure we transfer it into focusing on the most critically important issues, both domestically, when it comes to the climate action we need to take, and when it comes to putting pressure on our own leaders at international conferences for policy on an international level as well. So that's something that we need to think very hard about how we're going to manage.
No, thank you. Yes, I completely agree with you, James. One more thing which when I was leaving COP, there was one more huge amount of criticism from certain countries actually not committing to the targets, or even committing to a target which is really moved away in much later dates, say around 2100 or 2070, 2080, and that makes some of the countries kind of didn't want to sign up for a particular target for climate emission reductions. Do you think, and it was a year, we have to understand it was a year, all the countries faced an extreme challenge from COVID. So what is your perception of, does these black swan events, because climate change is going to bring more and more of these black swan events in our political space, and what do you feel about this? How do we tackle when we have a black swan event which we have to tackle immediately, whereas we also have to create this cognitive resonance that climate change also needs an immediate action, as COVID needed, if I may use that word. Frederick, would you like to come in here? Because yes. I think you're still talking with some of them there.
Yeah, so your question immediately makes my mind jump to the issue of loss and damage, because I guess a lot of what is happening on the ground when it comes to loss and damage in developing countries, even though we have the black swan events all over, like that we have to face on a global scale, a lot of loss and damage is already happening on the ground. And so since the 1990s, actually, when the UNFCCC itself was being negotiated, there were already these calls by the small islands developing states to have an insurance mechanism for loss and damage. And I mean, I don't want to narrate the whole story of how loss and damage came about, but so since one thing that I wanted to mention that kind of was for me a positive thing that came out of COP26, even though it was quite grim, I agree that to be there, was, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of sense of hope that at least the public attention on loss and damage was really focused during that event. Like, I've been working on loss and damage for 5 or 6 years now, and when I first learned about it, I thought, wow, loss and damage, I mean, why is this not on everybody's mind? Why is this not on the news every day? Like, that kind of relates to your question, because it's such a fundamental issue that connects, that goes beyond climate change itself in a way. And so last year I was really positively surprised to see it more on the public agenda. And this is what I think is one of the reasons why, for example, this year there was already kind of a success for loss and damage, because loss and damage finance became a sub-agenda item for COP. So it's actually going to be talked about and negotiated, loss and damage finance. And so there is kind of this sense of hope in this space. But then again, I just wanted to mention a bit like what's it like to be at COP. For me, at least, it's always kind of a very mixed feeling. So since I go there partly as a researcher in my kind of bubble that I'm like the stuff that I'm interested in, it's really kind of cool to go to these kind of conferences, because you meet people that are interesting. Some of the people you know, and some people you only see on TV. And on the other hand, it's this very grim topic and this very grim issue. But then, for example, today, when I heard the speech by Antonio Guterres, where he said, well, we are fighting for our lives and we are losing, and we're kind of on a road to climate hell. And it was a very urgent and spine-chilling speech. But then when you looked around, kind of looked into the other people's faces, there was kind of this determination to do something about it. And kind of, so it's a very paradox feeling to be at a COP where stuff is happening that you're probably not happy about in terms of negotiations, but at the same time, when you are in some of the zones, there's like the sense of, for example, from NGOs, like we need to get stuff done. And so it's a very mixed feeling. But again, this all goes back, I guess, to this kind of public pressure and this pressure that we need to put on policymakers and delegations specifically in this space to kind of make things happen.
Yeah, no,
that makes sense.
That's so true, because that's what I said, that when we were in the COP, in the roundtables, it was so inspiring that there were leaders across, there were policymakers, there were larger NGOs who work, global NGOs who work across the world. They were saying things which were inspiring, which were positive, and yet right after that we went into the negotiation room and it was really grim. But I do get your point, Frederica, what you said, that everybody was very hopeful. So I think this year we might see some actions on that hope, and we do have a little bit more time for discussing the previous events, what are the successes or failures of COP and COP26, and what do we expect from COP27. So maybe I can go around the panel to hear from you, your views on the same topic.
Sure. Well, I guess what I thought one of the main successes from COP26, again with some heavy caveats that I will weigh in before people jump on me. On the NDCs front, the nationally determined contributions, which are the 2030 targets that countries bring forward for climate emissions reductions. This was the first iteration of the Paris ratchet mechanism, where every 5 years countries come forward and bring new, more ambitious targets. And people weren't sure whether or not it was going to work. But it did, to an extent. And the IEA released a report immediately following the summit saying that they expected, as a result of the summit, projected warming to go down from 2.1 degrees to 1.8 degrees, which is fantastic. But there are many caveats to that, and that's only if all the pledges and the targets that countries have stated are fully implemented, which at the moment is not happening, is looking quite unlikely to happen. But nevertheless, the fact that in that space, very short space of time, we can increase global ambition so much and shave an entire 0.3 degrees of warming projections is really exciting. And then the fact that following that, all countries agreed to come forward this year in just 1 year's time with even more heightened ambition and a new suite of NDCs, that was really exciting in that moment. Unfortunately, again, only 24, I think, of the 194 countries have come forward with those revised targets. So it feels like with every success, there is always a caveat to it. But nevertheless, that's what I found most exciting after the summit. And the fact that we are making this progress, even though it's way too sluggish and incremental, it's positive to an extent.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And right after that, we did see a lot of other countries, although not pledging towards a particular target, but said we'll make concerted effort towards that, and that itself, I think, is a positive, even though they were all fighting COVID in different resource situations. If you want to come in, I think you will have a lot of other experiences to share.
Yeah, totally. I think being at COP last year, it was my first COP I'd ever been to, but it was very interesting talking to people who had been to various historical ones, because one of the things that kept being mentioned over and over again was how inaccessible it was as an event, because historically people had been able to go in, they'd been able to witness it, they'd be able to, I suppose, essentially remind our governments that they were watching, versus you literally could not get into this conference without multiple layers of security and things like that. That was a big old barrier. And so I think there was this very strange sort of feeling of separation between sort of people and the conference, which isn't how it should be at all. And I was hoping that this year that wouldn't be the case again. If anything, I've heard it's worse this year. I do think the choice and location for COP this year is strange and disappointing, and I know it's the reason a lot of activists haven't gone, as well as obviously having to fly to a climate conference. So there's that side of things. I think one of the things I found really interesting last year was also sort of the reflection of these older activists that I was meeting on past COPs and the way that their sort of activism had evolved. And I was talking to one of them about sort of all the campaigning that went on at the various COPs before the Paris Agreement was agreed, and the big campaign that I didn't particularly had even known existed to do with the 1.5 degrees and how hard that had to be pushed in the first place, which is one of the reasons it was so disappointing that then sort of got let go a bit. But I guess I do just want to quickly remind why this 1.5 degrees is such an essential number, and it's one that we keep on circling back to over and over again. Sorry, just quickly, I guess my positive moment for climate conferences was I remember being 13 and the Paris Agreement got signed, and I was so excited because I thought we'd solved climate change. But the 1.5 degrees warming is so essential because it is the absolute maximum amount of warming that this planet can go through before countries start going underwater, before people start dying en masse more than they are already. And it is that sort of perspective that I want to push over and over again in terms of climate change, because the reason I got involved in climate change campaigning in the first place is because my family's from Bangladesh. It's a country I never hear about in the West unless we're talking about how it's being flooded and people are dying because of all this. Yeah, every single year. And so it's actually, I think when we talk about climate change, it's always in this very distant way, and it's always in these sort of very, very vague numbers. But I just want to reiterate that when we're talking about these percentages, this 1.5 degrees is, a 0.1%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but there is millions and millions and millions of people dying.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I think these numbers scare not just people, but they should be presented in a way. I think that's where also we should be gearing up, presented in a certain way that it actually scares the politicians. I remember when I was working with the data on tuberculosis and how housing was actually, the way the houses were designed were actually causing people to die of tuberculosis or getting tuberculosis. We all know that if we don't have a better built environment, we might get tuberculosis and we'll die. But when I showed that to not only to the politicians, not only to the policymakers, but also to the residents, that's when the scare happened. That's when people started taking cognizance of it. That's when politicians or policymakers actually started looking at the policy. So I think we also have the responsibility to visualize the impact of 1.5 degree. What does 1.5 degree look like? I do see in social media a lot, what does 5,000 people look like, or what does 10,000 people look like? And I think it's now our responsibility to show the world that what does 1.5 would look like. If it's a great project to kind of even start thinking, and if hopefully somebody would do it before next COP. Joycelyn, I want to hear from you because you come from a very different perspective of indigenous population, their conservation, and that's very, very important because a lot of us do not even know of certain communities, and they would probably be the first one to be on the line of this 1.5 degree threat.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to my point about COP being important, but that the people who are experiencing, the brunt of the climate crisis aren't even there. There's no way they would be able to get there, let alone get a badge. Even, students at universities in Ghana have no way of getting a badge. So I think that's a big thing about COP, who is represented, and obviously COP is in Africa this year. Not that necessarily means that more Africans are being represented. But I think it's really important to think about numbers as well, especially when it comes to loss and damage. That was actually something I was quite disappointed with last year, because even though it was more in the public sphere, the public was talking more about reparations and loss and damage, I think that the really nuanced conversations that were needed politically didn't happen. And that's not just about governments not achieving the $100 billion a year, which is supposed to go to a fund for climate vulnerable locations, but also how does that money get distributed? It's not enough to just say, okay, you know, what happens when the Pakistan floods happen this year? They are contributing to 0.4% of global emissions, but a third of the country was underwater. Is the money supposed to go to the government? How does it get, you know, distributed to people on the ground? And so I think that the lag in that conversation is really stopping us from creating the actual mechanisms to get money to people, and to support communities who are on the front line, who aren't going to be at COP, who aren't going to have their voices heard, who are losing farms, who are losing their livelihoods. I think that's really important, and I would have hoped that that would happen at this COP. Who knows? We're yet to see, but I think that for me is really important, figuring out a mechanism for loss and damages, for reparations, because us in the UK, the US are some of the biggest contributors historically, and I think that hasn't also been recognised in conversation, political conversation. Specifically, we still look at loss and damage or supporting adaptation and mitigation as like a sort of charity case, not as a debt that is owed to the Global South. So for me, that would be a hope in future COPs, that we can, you know, now we're talking about climate justice, say, and that's a huge thing, and for activists who were, you know, at COP 20 years ago, maybe that's a huge success, and I think I'd be hoping to feel that way about how we speak about wealth distribution and responsibility for climate, for the climate emergency.
No, this is fantastic what you said, because looking it as a debt and not really as a charity is so important. And I think last year's COP, this is the last thing I'm going to say about last year's COP, because I was very disappointed when I left Glasgow. And I think in the last year's COP, this was not discussed. The only thing was discussed how much of committed contributions we're going to make, but how is this going to reach to the population who are currently under flood or who are currently homeless. And overnight we did see a huge population being homeless because of a climate crisis. And it's now reality, so it's not really very much moved or distance in the future. It's probably near. It's almost like we're not understanding what is that dinosaurs look like, if I may use that word. But I think we should move. We have about 4 minutes left to discuss about what do we expect from this current COP. Like, what would you expect if you are there, or if you want to communicate to the leaders? Maybe I want to again go from James and then Maya and then Joycelyn and then Frederick.
Yeah, well, it's it's difficult to say. I'm not going to pretend I have any in-depth knowledge about COP27 and what's going to happen. I've been a little more disconnected than last year. But unfortunately, what I've heard on the grapevine is that although there's a much stronger focus this year on loss and damage and on finance, they want to make it the implementation COP, where they get really into the details of how we're going to fund all of these grand plans that were announced last year. It's looking like a lot of countries are already starting to backtrack a bit on those fronts. I think Boris Johnson today, I read a news story just before coming here saying that he thought the UK wouldn't be able to fund climate reparations, which is really quite concerning, because we're one of the biggest historic contributors, and we're also one of the people that likes to consider ourselves a climate leader on this global stage. And this lack of leadership from us really won't bode well. The US as well agrees something needs to be done, isn't looking likely to commit to a financing facility for loss and damage. So I don't know. If maybe other people will have more clear ideas of what they expect to come out, but I'm not looking hugely optimistic, I'm afraid to say.
Well, do you think these sort of visualizations that you look at, the climate clock or something more devastating, I don't know what, we need probably special sessions for that. Do you think that putting forward to actually common people of countries who need the climate finance would be more helpful?
Well, I think the climate clock actually is quite controversial in some ways. And one of the ways in which we need to be careful using it is that putting it towards people in developing countries who maybe have less of a potential to impact the main political discussions that are taking place, and kind of forcing this fear and this responsibility towards them is something we have to avoid. But I am pleased to say there is another version of this at COP27, another really, really big one. And that has also the capacity to show some new numbers, one of which is counting the amount of money that's being transferred from developed to developing countries for financing the green transition, for mitigation and for adaptation. And so hopefully, I hope that if we can shine a really strong global spotlight this year on that very specific issue and raise public awareness of how much needs to be done in that space, then that might help for some really more targeted public pressure. But we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, Maya.
I think similar to I don't know what I want from COP this year. I want the basics to be done, I suppose. I feel like we spend so long talking about sort of the nuances of a perfect handling of the situation. It's like at the moment I just want the bare minimum done, and it looks like we're not getting it in any direction. I do think though, and I think this is in terms of the wider climate movement as well. I didn't mention anything positive earlier. I think this is one thing, which is there has been a big narrative shift in the way that both we and our governments are talking and thinking about climate change. Where I think in the past, it's been something that's been seen as so individualistic and so personal, sort of this idea of the carbon footprint and things like that, which was, invented by BP, and I'm so glad that finally we are leaving that behind, and there is just this acknowledgement that it is a systemic issue. It is down to governments, oil companies, fossil fuel companies, that sort of thing, which I think is such an important shift because we finally, for the most part, stopped pointing the finger at individual people and going you're killing the planet when it's not true. I do think, if we're talking about a perfect COP or a perfect handling of the climate crisis, that obviously this will never happen, but I think acknowledgement of the real root of what is causing climate change, which is capitalism. We are dealing with this issue because we are currently existing in an economic system that is based on constant extraction and exploitation, and our planet just can't handle it anymore. And that's the same reason that climate change is so linked to colonialism. And so really my perfect solution in terms of climate change is moving away from those economic systems into a much more circular economy that's not based on constant extraction and exploitation. But I don't think they're going to do that at COP27 this year. So.
Let's hope someday decolonization would be an agenda in the COP. Yes, Joycelyn.
I think kind of on the same line of that, it would be great if we could just stop, working with fossil fuel companies. That would be a good start for a COP to just say that we shouldn't. Last year they changed the language to something related to, I can't remember the exact language, but they changed the language to basically say that fossil fuels were a big contributor, the biggest contributor to the climate crisis. And I think whilst changing one word in the discussions is a step, it's really not enough. I don't think fossil fuel companies should be at COP. I don't think that they should be funding any part of COP or any climate conferences. And so I think that I hope some people call it out. I hope there are some people who, obviously it's a really hard job, but are brave enough to call it out at COP and to make clear that following COP shouldn't have fossil fuel companies having such a huge influence on the decisions that are made by politicians. And part of that will be how are we funding other energy sources, how are we funding clean transition, but also how that clean transition doesn't come again at the cost of people and the planet through mining of raw materials. So really thinking about the energy transition and how we can remove fossil fuels from our sort of way of living and decision making. I
understand. Frederica, you want to come in?
Yes, so I was going to say something along a similar line as James. So we have to keep in mind that this year is an implementation COP, and kind of the major decisions happen every kind of 5 years, what we saw at COP21 and COP26 last year. But that in mind, that doesn't mean that we can't have like actual negotiations and kind of discussions and kind of engagement with issues. And I think one interesting thing that to look out to. So in terms of loss and damage, my hopes are not that high either, because it's just a very difficult subject, and it's been super hard. Like there's this paper, for example, by Van Halla and some others that call it the ghost of compensation, to say, well, it's kind of haunted by this idea that developed countries have a liability and this kind of compensation claims, which is true, of course, but then again, it kind of always deadlocks negotiations. So one of the strategies I heard about is kind of to instead call for loss and damage finance in the spirit of solidarity.
Yeah, she's in Egypt, and
of course it's something that we began to see how maybe this. Sorry, did I?
Yeah, you did cut out a bit.
Maybe I cut out there.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, my internet is not that good. Can you hear me now again?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So I was just saying it will be interesting. I have a bit of hope that with this new strategy of kind of calling for a pact for climate solidarity, kind of might take some of this edge off the topic of loss and damage with this kind of ghost of compensation, and might lead to some more action compared to what we've seen in the last couple of years. And then the other small thing I wanted to add is also that I'm really interested in how the science will be included this year at the conference. So last year with the Glasgow Climate Pact, science and the IPCC Working Group 1 report on the physical science base was quite central and quite key to the text. So there was a lot of urgency framing and science specifically, like quoting from the report. So I'm hoping that, and we'll see what that over the next 2 weeks, how far kind of the reports play a role this year, that the report on adaptation and the one on mitigation that came out, both of them came out earlier this year. And I'm just hoping that people will pay attention to those key findings, and that just reiterate the urgency that we're already aware of, but kind of, that people should listen to the science basically in the negotiations rooms as well.
Thank you. Yes, I do remember this was quite important during COVID, when politicians were standing beside doctors and scientists, and that created a lot of confidence in the people. So I would like to now open it to the House for questions. And we have, I'm pretty sure we'll have a lot of questions, and we have a...
Yes, so, okay, this microphone is working. So we have a throwable microphone, which is a very cool innovation. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand. I'll toss you this. Just speak down into the mic on the top here. And then anyone attending online, if you want to type your questions into the Q&A, we will go through those at some point. So, yes, any questions in the House?
I'm very intrigued, and I take Joycelyn's point about, we need to engage with renewables. How much extra % of renewables do we have to have on the Earth clock to increase the time by an hour, or whatever it is?
I'm ashamed to say I couldn't tell you that.
Oh.
I think the goal is to that they're pushing in Egypt is to have 100% renewables by 2030 in the electricity sector. But I wouldn't quote me on that. But the long and short is much faster than it's counting up right now.
If I can just state one statistics for you from UK. If we need to reach the net zero target of 2050, we need to decarbonize 2 buildings per minute. So that's what we are moving towards. Any other questions? I think we can.
Yay! I was just going to ask, really, what do you think should be the role of climate protest during COP27? And what do you think should be like the message coming out of protests that the wider public can really understand and get behind. I know from my experience in the climate movement, there's a lot of division, a lot of different priorities right now, which at times can feel a bit unhelpful. But what do you think is like the very simple message that we should be like going out there and saying on the 12th of November on the day of action or any other protest during COP27?
I want to take this question.
Yeah, sure. I think like protest plays such an important role in terms of climate change and stuff like that, and it's interesting that you mentioned the climate change movement to an extent like spends a lot of time arguing with itself, because I think people don't really remember now, but that was one of the things that was so exciting actually about Extinction Rebellion when it first turned up, because it sort of countered all of that, and at the time, ironically, sort of was trying to embrace everyone. It has now split into various factions. But I think, you know, I think protest doesn't need to be palatable. I know there's been lots of discourse around the Just Stop Oil stuff at the moment, but I think it doesn't have to be palatable, and I think you can have different people that you're speaking to as well. I think you can have things like Youth Strikes for Climate, which felt to me like they were to, you know, the country, the world, society, whatever, or you can have protests that are much more aimed at your government, at your leaders, and I think at COP, that is much more the feeling, where it's like actually it's not even a single particular thing, but more like people care about this, people are watching, people are paying attention, so you need to, I suppose, not completely fail at this. But I'd love to hear what the atmosphere at COP27 is like this year, because I know a lot of activists who were very wary about going to COP because they didn't feel like they'd be comfortable protesting there this year, or that it would be safe. So I'd love to hear from Frederick. If she's maybe not.
Maybe not.
But,
maybe we can.
But yeah, so I mentioned earlier, but I think the choice in terms of where COP is this year is very unfortunate.
Yes, I see you looking at me. You just cut out a bit, but I could just about hear what you said. So I know it's, at least that's my feeling as well, being here. There's a lot of police around. It's very heavily guarded, and it feels quite of dystopic here because it looks like from a Star Wars movie, because it's just like the desert, and then there's army everywhere, and then there's the conference, and so I don't think there's a lot of.
That's a good. Maybe Frederica, you can type your response. Antoinette, can you request her to type her response? Then it's easier for us.
Yeah. Around again last year. Sorry, you're cutting out again. Sorry.
Can you type your response? Then it's easier for us to read. We'll read your response out.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We can take on questions from...
Yeah. Just real quick, I had a question for the panel on that. The question mentioned an International Day of Action on 12 November. Can you elaborate for our audience what that entails? If you'd want to, yeah. Here.
So yeah, I know within the international climate movement, so next Saturday, the 12th of November, has kind of been marked as the International Day of Action for Climate Justice, where there will be lots of protests going on all across the world, targeted at world leaders to try and take action for climate justice. I know in the UK there is a big protest that's happening in London. I think there are some other protests at various other places in the country. I know there's one in Birmingham because that's where I'm from. I don't know off the top of my head about Cambridge or anywhere else because I'm not as familiar in those climate movements. I've only got to uni here a few weeks ago. But yeah, the message as far as I'm aware is in the UK certainly is very much kind of has this dual emphasis on climate justice and also about criticising Egypt's human rights record as well. I don't know if you know that there are thousands of political prisoners in Egypt right now, including a British-Egyptian dual national called Alaa Abdel Fattah, who is currently on hunger strike, trying to secure access to the British consulate, which he so far has not been able to securing the government hasn't really worked very much with him. I know a lot of conversations about climate justice, a lot of conversations about human rights, and there's going to be big protests across the world on Saturday. Is that...
I think also Global Action Now, their Instagram page, has lots of information about the protests.
I don't know, is there anything happening in Cambridge?
I think people normally go down to London.
Yeah.
Or will there be like a coach or something?
Probably not, to be honest, but I can find out.
We have questions.
Yeah, a few.
My question is about what we need governments to do versus what we can do ourselves. Like, how much can we achieve as the people letting the governments discuss whatever they want to discuss? Can we shut fossil fuel companies down with protests? Can we make our permaculture farms and community kitchens? Like, how much can we achieve without the government support, and what do they need to do?
That's a complex question, how much we can do. I don't really know the percentage breakup that how much we can achieve versus how much political action is needed. But I have realized, at least here in this part of the world, we still feel dissonance towards somebody using a lot of plastic, or we are using some things which can damage the environment. But there are parts of the world where they do not feel this. So I think as responsible citizens of the world, we have to create a movement around ourselves which will create that dissonance that, no, I don't want to do this. This is not really, it should actually itch all of us that this is not the right path that we are going. And that probably can create a peer network, and I think we are all in that path. So I really don't know the percentage breakup. That's also, I don't think it's achievable, but on the whole, we should be able to contribute to that. Do you want to add to it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are two parts to it. There is just no doubt that most of the impact of climate crisis does come from systemic change, does come from large companies, multinational companies. And so that's really important, and I guess that's why public pressure is really important, boycotting is really important, rather than focusing on like specific individual actions. I think that some of the most important things that individuals can do is hold systems to account and to hold corporations and governments to account. But that's really when you're thinking about like carbon and pollution, which is kind of the big topic of COP. But when you're talking about just like life and what makes healthy societies, that's when what we do in our local communities becomes really, really important. It doesn't make it less important that it doesn't account for 50% of carbon emissions, because environmental issues aren't just about carbon. And so if we can, have communities that don't use plastic, or we have good recycling schemes, and we have good local farms, and I mean, there's Cambridge Land Justice, there's the Cambridge, the kitchen, it's Cambridge something kitchen, Cambridge Community Kitchen, there's a Cambridge Farm. There are so many things that you can do. There's like Paradise Nature Reserve, which I live really close to. So there are loads of things that people should be getting involved in, and I just don't think that's even really anything to do with climate. I think that's just for like a healthy, sustainable society, that it's important for people to engage in that kind of stuff. So I think that, they both go hand in hand. It's not less important to do sort of community things just because it doesn't have,
No, I totally agree with that. I just wanted to add really quickly as well. I think especially, we are in a cost of living crisis. A lot of people really, really struggling at the moment. And I think it's when you start to talk about things like local allotments, community kitchens, stuff like that, I feel like it's such a good example of how environmental issues are so intersectional and do tie in with other things. And it's like, actually, when you do just have a healthy, green, local community, people live better as well. That was all.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I also open on this quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'd like to, just basically reiterate what's already been said, in that in terms of carbon emissions reductions, a huge amount of that, the power to do that, is concentrated in the hands of very few people, which can sound like a bad thing at first, but actually, when you consider the fact that if that weren't the case, we'd have to change the minds and the actions of billions of people around the world, it's actually much easier this way. If we can pinpoint pressure on just a few turning points, then that's actually far more achievable. Yeah. But absolutely building resilience in local communities as well, and making sure that we can alleviate the impacts of whatever change happens, just as important.
Absolutely.
She had her reply there.
Can you read it? Can you
sure.
read it? Yeah.
So I think the situation is very different this year from last year. There will be less opportunities for activities, but I have seen delegates that are associated with different engaged organizations, so I'm hoping they find other outlets like side events, etc., to take part in the conversations. And we also have a question online, Ronita, if...
yeah, that's fine.
Sure, and it relates to it, so pop it up here, actually. So it's from Birgit Schneider, and it's a question about the speakers about activism. And so hearing Ronita speak so passionately about visualizing climate change impacts, is the activism we currently see in the news daily something that they're supporting?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Here, there.
Can you might be able to pull it up?
Questions to the speaker about activism, hearing Ronita speak so passionately about visualizing climate change impact. Is the activism we currently see in the news daily something they are? I just want to be very clear that when I said we want to make visual impact, I'm not saying just numbers, I'm saying pictures, images, what climate change can bring, very powerful, real images. You know, I always feel visual communication has a lot of power. I'll tell you why. When have conjectured view about different communities, and then when I go into those communities, I see a different picture through. So when I capture through my lens, it's a different color, it's a different picture, it's a different emotion. Whereas I see through journalism, it's a different emotion. So maybe journalism has one particular agenda, but if we open it up to communities and tell us what exactly climate change looks to you, or why do you think climate change is important, I think a different colored picture would emerge. And that's what would be very powerful for us to communicate across. So when I say, of course, whatever we see in our news, all the images that we see in the daily news is also very important. But it seems very distant, moved in the future. When it comes from the people, from our community, it might not look that distant. It might actually scare. So at some point, because I work with local policymakers a lot, I have seen scaring them with numbers and images actually gets a lot of work done. So it has to push that button of panic and say, no, this seems really close. It's now is the time we have to act, or we have to run, or there's no other way. So that's when I say we have to create these powerful visualizations. I'm trying to say not something that looks like a news report, or not something that looks like, oh, this is another item in the agenda. It should look like there's no other item in the agenda. This is what we have to look at. I think looking at the visuals from Pakistan flood, I don't know how much emotionally, I'm a very emotional person in one sense, but it actually emotionally moved me a lot. Overnight, 1 million population lost their houses. This is not a number which is now moved quite away in the past. It might happen here too. We did see a very devastating heat wave. Like 42 degrees, do we really know how to cope with it? And it's going to be more and more. So from 22 to 2026, we are going to see more frequent of these heat waves, more frequent of climate change impacts on our Earth. That's what I meant when I said visualizing climate change. Yeah.
Yeah. Over here.
Thank you. Hearing you speak now, another question came to my mind. What is the role of media in all of these?
That's a very, very important question.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say we see how media portray wars, as they should, as the horrible things that they are. But when we look at media portraying, for example, floods and natural disasters attributable to climate change, do they make the connection between those disasters and climate change to an adequate extent? And if not, how can we call media out on that?
I think today we have a very strong power of social media, but I would like you all to respond to it because you are this generation who react with or interact with a lot of media. So maybe Maya, you can go, and then James, and then Joycelyn.
Yeah, I think mainstream media isn't very good about talking about climate change in various different ways. So, for example, in the UK, I'm from the southwest, where we get a lot of flooding, which didn't happen 10 years ago. But every single year it's just kind of like, oh, it's that time of year again, it's flooding. And they never talk about the fact that it's climate change, or the fact that that didn't happen before, or the fact that people are dying. And then at the same time, you're sort of getting the opposite happening in other events around the world. So I remember when there was the flooding in Germany, I think a couple of years ago now, the whole narrative around that was like, wow, I can't believe this happened. Where did this come from? And again, there was no mention, or very little mention, of climate change. And it's sort of almost seen as this sort of dirty word. And I think one of the things that we need more of, especially in the UK, is just explicitly calling things what they are. Because I think for a lot of people, there is this feeling that climate change is very distant. It is things like the Pakistan floods that are happening to people across the world. And it's not something that has reached Europe or reached the UK yet. And so I think just like calling it what it is something that we need more of. And it's so basic and so easy as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's that aspect, just explicit and responsible journalism. There's the aspect of media companies that have historically had a role in climate denial, then progressing more into climate skepticism. And I think what we need to watch out for these days is climate doomism, saying things are inevitable. And also portraying the cost of transitioning to net zero as being too expensive. But I think we need to think about how we do messaging, whether it's more effective to talk about things in an optimistic sense, or to use alarmism, or both. I think the studies and meta-analysis on how effective these kinds of communications are has come out pretty ambivalent. And so we need to really understand, I think, for the best kinds of reporting, how we can actually motivate people to act based on the stories that we're telling as well. I think that's the next stage, and that's really important.
I think it goes to the root of the motivations of media. I remember being on a panel this year with Channel 4 in a room of media professionals, and we can't even get to the point of them talking about climate in the right way, because that's not their motivation. At the core, they're not trying to talk about climate. They don't really care about climate. And the way that it works as a job is that you're working for headlines, especially now with social media. You're working to get people to click on a headline. And so, that's why we see articles where it's 42 degrees and they've got lots of people like at the beach in like rubber dinghies. It's like, that's not what happens at 42 degrees. But it gets clicks. And so it's kind of like when we talk about what's at the core of this economy, like capitalism, at the core of journalism is clicks. And unless we change that motivation of like why journalism is happening anyway, then that's not really going to change. The impetus for them to do the right thing isn't going to change, and that needs to be rewarded.
Or maybe use them to our benefit.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, let's create clickbaits.
Someone actually did this. They did there was a project where they used artificial intelligence to seed clickbaity media articles, rewriting articles on climate change, and it was a really cool project. I can't remember the name, but I'll share it later.
I strongly feel climate change issues are presented very in a documentary style. It has to be presented in a more normal style that we see. If the way they present when a political party loses their vote, and the way they present a new prime minister coming in, I think we have to present climate change in that aspect. I don't think that it's still very documentary style. It's still very agenda driven. It shouldn't look like agenda driven. Another thing, the power is social media. We have not talked about it. There's a lot of greenwashing that goes on with fossil fuels, and it's very difficult for people to really understand the difference. And so we know the Twitter is a very powerful tool with Elon Musk there, but we also know it can actually go horribly wrong at one point. So how do we create that sense of barrier that this is not something I'm going to interact with, or maybe interact with it and make it more powerful and create it as a way telling to the population that this is not right information. So there is a lot of movement towards that, but I think media becomes very, very powerful, the way we present it. Any other questions? I saw a lot of hands up.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, how are we on time with...
We're officially at 7:15, so we can keep going rather than networking, just keep Q&A until 7:30.
Yeah, so or we can just close the panel and then
just
keep going. All right, or should we take one more question and then close the panel?
That's kind of what I was thinking, maybe, and then give people a chance if they want to ask their questions just to individual panelists. Perfect. Okay, one last question. No pressure.
Hello. So I think you all touched on at some point that I think almost everyone in here feels somewhat disappointed by the current British government, unless it's changed in the last hour. Both on a policy aspect and in a financial aspect, like you mentioned about loss in sort of reparations. Are there any countries that you think we should be looking towards? Is there anyone that is doing it correctly? And if so, what are they doing that we're not? And what can we learn from them?
That's a big, huge question. Enrique, you want to come in?
If I understood that question correctly, it's like what countries can we look up to in terms of like loss and damage finance? Okay, yeah, that's actually a point I wanted to maybe mention as kind of one of the hopeful things also from COP26 was that we saw some subnational actors actually pledge some funds, loss and damage, which has never happened before at the time. And most recently, I think it was Denmark who also pledged some funding as the first national actor. And so that's the one country to kind of look out for, and maybe, so I'm kind of hopeful that maybe this trend will continue, that even though maybe at the negotiation level we don't make as much progress as we would like to, but then at the national and subnational level some action is happening.
Thank you so much.
I think she might have mentioned it when it cut out, but I think the other person was Sturgeon. She did some loss and damage donations last year, outside of Britain as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I think we had a wonderful evening. It was kind of amazing to hear your experiences, and sometimes it resonated with me. Sometimes I also felt the same thing, but when I didn't know where to voice this. So this is fantastic, and we have touched upon very important issues of decolonization. We have touched upon issues of how to use strong, powerful visualizations. We have touched upon issues on how to get representation across the board to the politicians in a global scale. So I think these are very important issues, probably not discussed. Probably we will see them emerge with the following COPs. But thank you so much, and thank you all for joining this evening.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, panelists. I also want to give a big thank you to Antoinette, the woman behind the scenes organizing all of this.